What if I told you that one of the nations many people fear, debate, and misunderstand today has been sitting in the pages of the Bible for thousands of years, not as a side note, not as a random empire in the background, but as a nation God allowed into some of the most decisive moments in biblical history? And what if the truly unsettling part is not simply that Iran appears in Scripture, but that Persia, the ancient name most closely associated with the region of modern Iran, was in ways no one. Because when most people think about the Bible, they think about Israel. They think about Egypt. They think about Babylon. But Persia, Iran, for many people that feels distant, political, or modern. And yet the Bible refuses to keep Persia at a distance. It brings Persia close, close to prophecy, close to exile, close to restoration, close to the story of Israel, and close, in a very sobering way, to the story of how God rules the nation. That matters more than you think, because sometimes the most shocking truth in Scripture is not just that God blesses his people. It is that he governs history so completely that he can even take a foreign empire, a pagan king, a palace that did not know his covenant, and turn it into an instrument for his purpose. And if that is true, then Persia is not just a history lesson. It is a warning, a revelation, and for the person listening right now, it is a reminder that God's sovereignty does not end at the borders of what feels safe, familiar, or holy to you. Sometimes God works through what you least expect. Sometimes he writes his plan through powers that do not even realize they are being used. And Persia may be one of the clearest examples of that in the entire Bible. So tonight, I want to take you on a journey through Scripture and history. Back to the flood, back to the table of nations, back to the rise of empires, back to a king named Cyrus, back to Esther in a Persian palace, back to Daniel's visions, back to the mysterious wise men from the East, and forward all the way to prophetic passages that still make believers pause when they read them. Because once you see Persia in the Bible, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand why that matters, you will never read the story of God's dealings with the nations the same way again. The Bible does not present history as random motion. It presents history as governed motion. Kings rise, empires expand. Cities fall, captives weep, doors close, nations boast. And over all of it, the hand of God is never absent. Persia proves that, and that is where the story begins. If you want to understand Persia's biblical role, you have to begin where the Bible begins, after the flood, with the descendants of Noah. Genesis 10 gives what is often called the Table of Nations. And in that chapter, among the sons of Japheth, you find the name Madai. The biblical tradition has long associated Madai with the Medes. In the same chapter, among the sons of Shem, you also find Elam, another ancient people connected to lands east of Mesopotamia. That matters because the world that would later be associated with ancient Iran was not biblically invisible. Its ancestral lines appear very early in the scriptural map of the nations. And that is your first clue. The lands tied to Media, Elam, and later Persia are not introduced in the Bible as a surprise at the end of the story. They are woven into the story from near the beginning. Now, that does not mean Genesis 10 is giving you a modern political map. It is not, and it would be careless to flatten the ancient world into modern boundaries too quickly. But it does mean this: The biblical world already has room for the peoples and regions that would later shape the history of Media and Persia. The stage is being set long before most readers realize it. The names are there, the roots are there, the nations are already spreading, and God already sees where history is going. That should make you pause, because sometimes you think God only begins dealing with something when it becomes visible to you. But Scripture keeps showing the opposite. God often starts the story long before you recognize the pattern. What looks sudden to you has often been forming for generations. Persia will later emerge as a dominating force in the ancient world. But biblically speaking, the ground beneath that empire was already present in the earliest genealogies of post-flood humanity. The Bible is telling you from the start that the nations matter. Their lines matter. Their place in history matters. And above all, God's oversight of them matters. That is the first layer. But the second layer is even more striking, because Persia does not simply appear in Scripture as one more nation among many. It rises into the center of the biblical drama at the very moment when Israel looks broken, displaced, and humiliated. And that is where the story turns. By the time Persia rises to prominence, Jerusalem has already suffered devastation. The Babylonian Empire had conquered Judah, the temple had been destroyed, and many of the people had been carried away into exile. The trauma of that moment runs through books like Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, and later Ezra. From a human point of view, it looked as if Babylon had the final word, and the people of God had been crushed beneath imperial power. And maybe that is one reason this story matters so much to people even now. Because there are seasons when your life feels like Judah after the fall. Not because everything is literally destroyed, but because something holy in your world feels broken. What you thought would stand has fallen. What you prayed would survive has been hit. The future you imagined has gone dark. And the hardest part is not only the pain. It is the interpretation of the pain. You start wondering whether the destruction means the promise is over. You start wondering whether silence means abandonment. You start wondering whether the chapter that shattered you also ended you. That is how exile feels, and if you do not understand exile, you will never understand why Persia matters. Because Persia rises in the Bible not when Israel is strong, but when Israel is wounded. Not when the temple is glorious, but when the temple is gone. Not when the people are triumphant, but when they are displaced and waiting. That is when God begins moving a foreign empire into place. Historically, Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, founded the Achaemenid Empire, conquered Media, expanded westward, and took Babylon in 539 BCE. His empire became larger than any previous Near Eastern empire, stretching across an enormous multi-ethnic world. But the Bible does not tell that story as mere political expansion. It tells it as providence. 2 Chronicles says that in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord stirred his spirit so that the word spoken through Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Ezra opens with the same shocking note. Cyrus, king of Persia, issues a decree that the house of the Lord in Jerusalem should be rebuilt. The biblical emphasis is not merely that Persia was powerful. It is that God moved through Persia at the exact point when restoration had to begin. And here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Because Isaiah speaks of Cyrus by name and describes him as the one who will say of Jerusalem that it shall be rebuilt, and of the temple that its foundations shall be laid. In the very next movement, Isaiah even calls Cyrus God's anointed, language that startles readers precisely because Cyrus is not an Israelite king. Do not move too fast past that a pagan ruler, a foreign monarch, a king outside Israel's covenant line, and yet in the biblical account, he becomes the agent through whom Jerusalem begins to breathe again. That is not normal. That is not predictable. That is not how human religion likes to imagine God working. We want God to move through familiar hands, through approved people, through clean categories, through leaders who already sound like they belong to the story. But Persia forces you to face a harder truth. God is not limited by your categories of who seems spiritually qualified to carry part of his historical purpose. That does not mean every empire is righteous. It does not mean every king is holy. It does not mean power itself is sanctified. It means God remains God, even while dealing with nations that do not know him, the way Israel was called to know him. And that changes the whole mood of the story, because now Persia is not merely the next empire after Babylon. It becomes the empire through which captivity begins to break. The same broad world of imperial force that had crushed Jerusalem under Babylon now becomes, under Persian rule, the arena where return becomes possible. The empire changes, the decree changes, the door opens. And when that happens, you are meant to feel the weight of it. God did not merely comfort his people with private feelings. He shifted world history. He moved an empire. He redirected a throne. He turned the key from Babylonian domination to Persian permission. And through that transition, he made a way for exiles to go home. That is the biblical picture, and it is staggering. Now here is where the story gets even deeper. Because one of the reasons Cyrus's role feels so dramatic in Scripture is that it reveals a painful contrast most believers eventually have to learn. What you call delay, God may call alignment. What you call silence, God may call timing. What you call nothing is changing. God may already be rearranging on a scale too large for you to see. Think about the exiles for a moment. They did not wake up one morning and simply feel better. They did not pray one small prayer, and suddenly the temple reappeared. They lived through years of waiting, years of remembering, years of grief, years in which it would have been very easy to conclude that Babylon had won and the story was over. But while they were waiting, history was moving, kings were rising, battles were being fought, empires were being realigned. A Persian ruler was advancing, and the God of Israel was not absent in any of it. That is one of the hardest lessons of faith, because when God is doing his deepest work, you are often not standing inside the explanation. You are standing inside the tension. You feel the ache. You feel the slowness. You feel the unanswered questions. But you do not yet see the empire being shifted on your behalf. And maybe that is exactly where some people are right now. You are looking at your life the way Judah could have looked at exile. All loss, all delay, all silence, all rubble. And what hurts most is not only what happened. It is the fear that what happened means God is done. But Persia interrupts that interpretation, because Persia is proof that God can be working in places you do not control, through people you do not expect, in timings you do not understand, to bring about the very thing you thought had died. And that does not mean every wait ends the way you planned. It does not mean every closed door becomes your preferred outcome. It does not mean faith is a formula. It means the silence of your immediate circumstances is not sufficient evidence that heaven has stopped moving. The exiles had no full view of Persian politics while they wept by memory and longing. But God did, And the same God who watched over Jerusalem's fall also watched over Babylon's fall. The same God who counted the years of captivity also knew the exact ruler who would open the way back. That is why Persia matters, not only because of what Persia did, but because of what Persia reveals about the character of God. He is not late, he is not trapped, he is not improvising, he is not powerless in the face of empires, he is not wringing his hands while history runs away from him. He is Lord over nations, and Persia is one of the places where Scripture makes that impossible to ignore. There is another fascinating layer to this. Outside the Bible, Persian royal policy is remembered as relatively broad and pragmatic in its treatment of conquered peoples. Britannica describes Achaemenid administration as generally liberal towards subject populations, and the Cyrus cylinder from Babylon records Cyrus presenting himself as a restorer of sanctuaries and local order after Babylon's fall. That does not prove every detail of Ezra by itself, and the cylinder is not a direct Jerusalem decree. But it does show that the biblical picture of Cyrus as a ruler willing to restore local worship fits the wider historical environment of early Persian rule. And that is important, because faith is not made stronger by pretending history is simple. The Bible is not giving you a cartoon villain on one page and a cartoon hero on the next. It is showing you a God who works in real history, through real rulers, with real political complexities, to accomplish his covenant purpose. Cyrus was still a king of empire. Persia was still imperial power. The world was still dangerous, and yet under God's hand, that very imperial machinery became the channel through which captives could return. The temple could be rebuilt, and prophecy could move toward fulfillment. That is a far more mature picture of divine sovereignty than many people are prepared for. Because some people only know how to trust God when he moves through obviously spiritual settings, through prayer meetings, through sermons, through worship songs, through moments that feel immediately holy. But one of the great shocks of the Bible is that God also moves through decrees, policies, thrones, tax systems, military victories, and shifts in world order. He is God in the sanctuary, and he is God over the map. He is God in tears, and he is God in timelines. He is God in the whispered prayer, and he is God in the fall of Babylon. Persia teaches you that, and once you see that, your reading of history changes. Your reading of waiting changes, and your reading of your own season may begin to change too. Because maybe God is not only working in the places where you can feel him easily. Maybe he is working in the structures, timings, and unseen movements that you cannot yet interpret. And that is where the story of Persia becomes personal. But Persia's role in the Bible does not end with Cyrus and the return. In some ways, the empire's most emotionally gripping moment comes not through a decree to rebuild, but through a crisis that nearly wiped out the Jewish people. And that brings you to the book of Esther. The setting is the Persian court. The Jewish people are scattered throughout the empire. A plot is formed against them. A decree of destruction is issued. And suddenly, the empire that had once opened a way for restoration becomes the setting for another terrifying test. That matters because Scripture does not tell simple stories. Persia is not presented as purely good or purely bad. It is presented as a powerful empire inside which both danger and deliverance can unfold. And honestly, that feels closer to real life, because many of the places God uses in your life are not neat. They are mixed. They hold tension. They hold threat and mercy in the same season. They are the kind of places where you cannot afford shallow discernment. The Persian palace in Esther is one of those places. A young Jewish woman becomes queen. A genocidal scheme advances. Fear rises. Silence becomes impossible. And then Mordecai sends Esther the words readers have never forgotten. Who knows whether you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Why does that line still grip people so deeply? Because it reveals something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Sometimes the place you never planned to be becomes the place where your courage is required. Sometimes the position that looked merely circumstantial turns out to be providential. Sometimes the room you entered for one reason becomes the battlefield where your obedience finally matters. Esther's story is not sentimental. It is dangerous. She risks her life by stepping forward. She does not know every outcome in advance. She moves in faith, not certainty, and through that courage, the intended destruction of the Jews is overturned. The plot collapses. The oppressor falls. The people survive. Once again, Persia becomes the imperial setting in which the preservation of God's people unfolds. Do you see the pattern? First, Persia becomes the empire through which the road home opens. Then Persia becomes the empire through which annihilation is averted. The same broad political world that could have swallowed the covenant people becomes, under God's providence, the place where they are sustained. That is not accidental storytelling. That is biblical theology in motion. God is showing you that the preservation of his people does not depend on the moral perfection of the surrounding empire. It depends on his sovereignty within it, and that is a word many people need, because some of you are waiting for perfect conditions before you believe God can still move. You are waiting for every threat to disappear, every system to become fair, every leader to become righteous, every environment to become comfortable. But the Bible keeps refusing that framework. God preserved Joseph in Egypt. God kept Daniel in Babylon. God moved through Persia for the exiles. And God preserved the Jews in Esther's Persia. He does not need ideal conditions to remain faithful. He does not need a clean backdrop to carry his purpose. He can move in exile. He can move in courts. He can move in danger. He can move in the shadow of decrees. And if that is true, then the darkness around a moment is not final proof that God is absent from that moment. The Persian palace in Esther is proof of that, and maybe that is why this part of the story hits so hard. Because some of the people listening are in a season where they feel surrounded by structures bigger than themselves. Systems, pressures, threats, delays, rooms where they do not feel in control. Esther speaks to that feeling. She reminds you that being outnumbered is not the same as being abandoned. She reminds you that hidden providence is still providence. And she reminds you that sometimes God has already placed you in the very place where the next chapter of protection will unfold. Not because it is easy, but because he is still writing the story. And then you come to Daniel, if Ezra shows Persia in restoration, and Esther shows Persia in preservation, Daniel shows Persia in prophecy. This is where the subject becomes even more profound. Because Daniel is not merely living through empire. He is being shown how empires fit into God's timeline. In Daniel 8, the prophet sees a ram with 2 horns, and the interpretation is unusually explicit. The ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. The following goat represents Greece. In other words, Persia is not just remembered after the fact. It is placed inside a prophetic sequence of empires. That is enormous, because one of the most unsettling things about great empires is that they feel ultimate while you are living under them. They feel too large to challenge, too strong to outlast, too permanent to fall. Babylon felt that way. Persia would feel that way. Greece would feel that way. Rome would feel that way, and yet Daniel keeps receiving the same message in different forms. These empires are real, powerful, and consequential, but they are not ultimate. They enter the stage on schedule. They leave the stage on schedule. They rage within limits. They dominate for a time. And then the story moves forward. Do you know how important that is? Because fear always tries to make the present power look final. That is what fear does. It magnifies the empire of the moment. It turns the pressure of now into the illusion of forever. But prophecy breaks that illusion. Daniel does not deny the strength of empire. He reframes it. Persia is mighty. Yes, Persia changes the world. Yes, Persia matters in the plan of God. Yes, but Persia is still under God. Persia still has a place, a span, and a boundary. Persia still serves a role. It does not fully understand. And that means the empire is never the throne. Let that settle. The empire is never the throne. That is the lesson Daniel presses into the bones of the reader. Kings may rule the visible stage, but they do not own the final script. The Most High does, and maybe that is one reason so many people misread the headlines of their own age. They confuse prominence with permanence. They confuse noise with sovereignty. They confuse the rise of power with the loss of divine control. Daniel will not let you do that. He forces you to see history vertically, not just horizontally. Not merely as one nation acting on another, but as kingdoms moving beneath a higher authority. That is why Persia in Daniel matters, because Persia is not only a historical empire, it is an example of a biblical principle. God names what men fear. God limits what men worship. God schedules what men think is unstoppable. And if that is true of Persia, then it is true of every other power that has ever made the world tremble. Now there is an important tension here. You should not read Persia's role in Scripture and become simplistic. The Bible does not ask you to romanticize empire. It does not ask you to baptize political power. And it certainly does not ask you to flatten every historical complexity into one emotional sermon line. Instead, it asks you to do something harder. It asks you to hold two truths at once. First, empires can wound, dominate, and terrify. Second, God can still use them, restrain them, and fold them into his purpose. That tension is vital, because if you lose the first truth, you become naive. If you lose the second truth, you become hopeless. Persia sits right in that tension. It is powerful enough to reshape the world. It is also limited enough to be used by God. It is dangerous enough to host a death decree in Esther. It is ordered enough to host a restoration decree in Ezra. It is mighty enough to appear in Daniel's visions. It is not mighty enough to escape the sovereignty of heaven. That is the mature biblical view, and maybe maturity is exactly what this subject calls for. Not panic, not shallow excitement, not speculative obsession, but reverent clarity, because one of the easiest ways to mishandle prophecy or biblical history is to turn it into sensational noise. People get intoxicated with names, conflicts, theories, and charts. They start speaking with certainty where Scripture leaves tension. They start acting as though every current event is a final code that only the most dramatic voice can decode. But the Bible invites a different posture, yes? Pay attention, yes. Read carefully, yes. Notice that Persia matters, yes. Notice that the prophets name real nations, but do not let fascination replace faithfulness. The deepest point is not that you can be obsessed with Persia. The deepest point is that you can become more certain of God. Because the same passages that put Persia on the map also put God on the throne. And that is what matters most. There is also a mysterious New Testament echo that many readers find fascinating. In Matthew 2, wise men magi come from the east to honor the child Jesus. Scripture does not explicitly say they were Persian, and it does not give a modern national label. But historically the term magi was strongly associated with a priestly or learned class among the Medes and Persians, which is why many readers have long connected the story with the broader world east of Judea, including Persian influence. Now be careful here. That is an inference, not a direct statement of the text. The text says they came from the east. It does not give you a passport. But even at the level of careful inference, the symbolism is powerful. Think about it. At the beginning of the gospel story, before Jesus has preached a sermon or worked a miracle in public, figures from the east arrive in reverence. Gentiles come seeking the King of the Jews. They recognize what Herod fears. They move toward the child, while Jerusalem's ruler moves in paranoia. That contrast is astonishing. The powerful man in Judea wants to destroy the child. The seekers from the east want to worship him, and whether you see those magi as directly Persian or more broadly Eastern sages shaped by that world, the theological point still burns. The story of God in Scripture has never been as provincially narrow as many assume. The nations are always near the edges of the promise, moving toward it, resisting it, serving it, or being judged by it. And Persia, or the wider world associated with the east beyond Judea, remains close to that story. Not at the center, the way Israel is in covenant history, but close enough to matter, close enough to witness, close enough to appear again and again when the biblical narrative widens its lens. That is why Persia feels different from many other names in Scripture. It is not a passing shadow. It lingers. It appears in genealogy. It appears in empire. It appears in restoration. It appears in preservation. It appears in prophecy, and perhaps even in a New Testament echo of Eastern seekers moving toward Christ. That repeated nearness should tell you something. The Bible does not accidentally keep Persia in view. And then, of course, you come to one of the most discussed prophetic references of all. Ezekiel 38 explicitly names Persia among the nations aligned in a future coalition. The text itself names Persia. That much is not disputed. Many modern readers connect that ancient name to modern Iran because Persia was the historic name widely used for the region associated with today's Iran. But the timing, structure, and precise fulfillment of Ezekiel 38:39 remain debated among interpreters, so care is needed. That distinction matters. Observation. Ezekiel names Persia. Inference. Many Christians identify that with modern Iran because of the historical continuity of the name and region. Application. Persia's presence in that prophetic vision means the Bible treats this nation as significant, not only in past history, but in the reader's sense of future expectation. And that is where many people either become careless or afraid. Some become careless by speaking more confidently than Scripture allows. Others become afraid because they read the prophecy without remembering the larger biblical pattern. So remember the pattern. Persia in the Bible is never outside God's reach, never outside God's naming, never outside God's oversight. Even when Persia appears in a threatening context, the point is not that God has lost control. The point is that he sees the nations before the nations see themselves clearly. Ezekiel is not meant to produce panic in people who belong to God. It is meant to produce sobriety. The nations are real. Prophecy is real. History is moving. God is not surprised, and once again, Persia stands inside that frame, not forgotten, not incidental, not beyond the prophetic horizon. That is why the subject of Iran and the Bible continues to grip so many believers. Not because sensationalism is healthy, but because the Bible itself repeatedly returns to Persia as a meaningful name in the story of nations. And if you hold that with wisdom, it should do something powerful inside you. It should make you more watchful without making you reckless, more sober without making you panicked, more biblical without making you speculative, and above all, more convinced that history is not running loose. Because if Persia can appear in Genesis-shaped origins, exilic restoration, palace preservation, prophetic sequence, and end-time vision, then the message is unmistakable. God does not merely save individuals. He governs eras. He governs kings. He governs movements of peoples. And he governs the rise and weight of nations. Now let me slow this down and make it even more personal. Why does any of this matter to the person who is listening late at night, tired, overwhelmed, maybe carrying questions that feel much closer than ancient Persia? It matters because Persia is one of the Bible's strongest reminders that God can be deeply at work in spaces that do not look devotional. You may be in a season that feels political, practical, procedural, delayed, earthly, even disappointing. A season of forms and gates and decisions and structures and closed rooms. A season where you do not feel dramatic spiritual emotion. A season where nothing about your life feels like a miracle. And maybe because of that, you think God is not near. But Persia tells another story. Persia tells you that God can move through decrees, through legal shifts, through power transitions, through doors opening at the level of history before they open at the level of your feelings. The exiles probably did not get a spiritual thrill every morning in Babylon. Esther did not live in a simple worship song atmosphere inside the palace. Daniel's visions came in the context of empire, pressure, and long-range history. In other words, some of God's holiest work unfolds in settings that do not feel obviously holy at first glance. That is why discernment matters so much, because if you only look for God in emotionally obvious places, you may miss him in strategically decisive places. Persia was a strategically decisive place, and God was there, not because Persia became Israel, not because empire became covenant, but because God remained sovereign over both. That is a word for the exhausted believer. You do not always need a louder feeling. Sometimes you need a deep interpretation. What if the place you called secular is actually one of the places where providence is moving? What if the delay you despised is part of the timing that makes the next chapter possible? What if the structure frustrating you right now is being used to protect, position, or preserve something you cannot yet see? That is not empty optimism. It is a biblical pattern. Judah had to wait. Cyrus had to rise. The decree had to come. The return had to begin. And when it did, it was clear that heaven had been moving long before the exiles could fully see it. Persia teaches you to respect hidden movement. It teaches you not to confuse visible stillness with divine inactivity. It teaches you not to conclude too early. It teaches you not to read the silence of your immediate surroundings as proof of God's absence from the larger story. And some of you need that desperately, because you are tired not only from pain, you are tired from misreading the pain. You thought the delay meant denial. You thought the silence meant distance. You thought the closed door meant rejection. You thought the foreign setting meant God was no longer near. But Persia keeps whispering a different possibility. Maybe the story is not over where it feels unfamiliar. Maybe God is not absent from the place that looks least spiritual to you. Maybe He's doing a work too structural, too historical, too layered to be reduced to your current emotional temperature. And if that is true, then your season may need rereading. There is one more truth Persia presses on the reader, and it may be the deepest one of all. Persia reveals that God can use what does not belong to you to preserve what He has promised you. Sit with that. God can use what does not belong to you to preserve what He has promised you. A foreign king helped open the way for Jerusalem's rebuilding. Persian court became the place where the Jewish people were preserved. A prophetic vision named Media and Persia as part of a sequence already known to God. And later, prophecy again kept Persia within view, again and again. God uses what is outside the covenant center to serve the covenant story. That is humbling because many people imagine God's work only in terms of direct possession. My gift, my plan, my open door, my circle, my language, my comfort, my people. But the Bible is larger than your ownership. Sometimes God uses someone else's throne to protect your future. Sometimes He uses a system you did not build to carry an answer you prayed for. Sometimes He uses a season you would never have chosen to guard a promise you could not have sustained too early. And that is why believers must learn to recognize providence beyond preference. Not everything God uses will feel familiar. Not everything God uses will flatter your categories. Not everything God uses will look like the answer while it is first unfolding. Persia did not look like Israel's answer at first. It looked like another empire. But under God's hand, it became far more than that. And maybe that is one reason some people miss what God is doing in their own lives. They reject the package because it does not resemble the form they expected. But God is not obligated to wrap deliverance in your preferred style. He is only faithful to His purpose. Persia proves that. So what do you do with all of this? You do not sensationalize it. You do not flatten it. You do not panic over it. And you do not ignore it. You let it do what Scripture intends. You let it enlarge your vision of God. You let it sober your reading of history. You let it humble your assumptions. And then you let it strengthen your trust in the sovereignty of the Lord over nations and timelines. Because in the end, the story of Persia in the Bible is not mainly about making you impressed with Persia. It is about making you unable to ignore God, the God who sees nations before they rise, the God who names rulers before their decrees matter, the God who can move a king's heart, the God who can preserve His people in a palace, the God who can place an empire inside prophecy, the God who can speak about the future of nations without losing the tenderness of His care for His people. That is the God this story reveals, and once you see that, even the frightening parts land differently. Yes, Persia appears in passages that stir serious prophetic reflection. Yes, the name carries weight in the biblical imagination. Yes, the intersection between ancient Persia and the modern conversation about Iran causes many believers to pay attention. But the final takeaway is not fear. It is reverence. Reverence for the God who governs what men cannot govern. Reverence for the God who sees the end from the beginning. Reverence for the God who is never confused by empire, never intimidated by kings, and never late to His own promise. That is the final payoff of this whole subject. Not that you become obsessed with the map, but that you become steadier under the throne, because the map changes, the throne does not. Babylon rose, Babylon fell, Persia rose. Persia fell, Greece rose. Greece fell, Rome rose, Rome fell. History keeps moving, God remains, and if he remained over Persia, he remains over every power that still makes the world anxious now. So maybe the real question is not only, what does the Bible say about Iran? Maybe the deeper question is, what does Persia teach me about God? It teaches you that God is not absent from world history. It teaches you that no empire is ultimate. It teaches you that waiting does not mean he has stopped moving. It teaches you that what feels foreign to you is not foreign to him. It teaches you that deliverance can begin in places you never expected. And it teaches you that the Lord of Scripture is also the Lord of nations. So if you are in a season where everything feels uncertain, hear this clearly. The silence around you is not the measure of God's activity. The complexity around you is not the limit of his rule. And the power in front of you is not the throne above you. Persia stands in the Bible as a witness to that truth. A witness that God can use foreign power without surrendering his holiness. A witness that God can preserve his people in hostile settings. A witness that prophecy is not vague mist, but history under divine authority. A witness that the God of Israel never lost his grip on the nations for even a moment. And maybe that is exactly what you needed to remember. That the story is never over where it went dark, that the empire is never the throne, that the delay is not always denial, and that what feels buried in history may still be revealing the faithfulness of God. So when you hear the ancient name Persia, do not hear only a nation. Hear a reminder God sees farther than you do. God rules higher than you feel. God moves deeper than you can measure, and no kingdom of men has ever been outside his reach. If this message speaks to where you are right now, write amen in the comments. And if you have been in a long season of waiting, you can write, I'm still trusting, because the same God who moved through Persia is still on the throne now, and the story is not over where it went quiet.